Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. It's been some time since we've been studying together about the Holy Temple. Now the holiday season is behind us, and we're going to get back into our structured study of the Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the chosen house according to Maimonides, plans for the reestablishment of the temple. We've had kind of a longish period where we emphasized teachings about the festivals, the days of awe, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and we had a very short period when we were offline. In the meantime, coming back now to the study about the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, realizing that as ever, circumstances around us are always changing, and the challenge is always ever present in the forefront of consciousness to try and realize that the concept of the Holy Temple is not just ancient history, not ancient history at all, not just a course of study like any other, but it is the idea of doing as much as possible to prepare for the building of the temple. This is why the laws of the temple are so important, why they've been preserved so accurately, and especially now, it's important for everyone watching to realize that once again, forces are at work that threaten the sovereignty of Jerusalem, Jewish sovereignty of Jerusalem, and really that threaten to undermine the sovereignty of Hashem, the God of Israel, over Jerusalem and the world. And any plan that's being discussed on a political level that takes into consideration the possible division of Jerusalem and the divestment of Jewish presence or Israeli sovereignty from the Temple Mount is a direct contradiction to the promises that God made and to the plans that God makes clear in His Holy Torah regarding the future redemption of Israel and all mankind. So everyone has to really find it in their hearts and find the proper way of reacting to this type of danger, the danger of the relinquishing of Jerusalem. And of course, the most basic banner around which we can really all unite is the aspiration, the yearning, the desire to see the rebuilding of the Holy Temple and the clear knowledge of what it represents for the Jewish people and for all mankind. So really the first step is for us to redouble our efforts, our understanding, deepen our desire to show Hashem that it really does mean something to us. The Torah is so limitless in the experience of study. The knowledge that we gain is only part of it. Our sages tell us that when we study the Torah, it's not just like a pursuit of knowledge to acquire more and more information and to be more and more learned about something. The goal of Torah study is to bring us to action. And that is the higher level of the pursuit of Torah study, for a person to want to be motivated to know how to function in this world as a servant of Hashem. How can we serve Him without knowing what He requires of us? And to bring others to the knowledge of the existence of God and what His plan is for the whole world. So Torah study is not just about me. It's not a me thing. It's not about me becoming more and more knowledgeable or respected because of the information that I possess. It's about action. It's about knowing how to live. And how much more so do we see that in the case of the organized and structured study of the laws pertaining to the Holy Temple, wherein the entire purpose of studying these laws is not just to be familiar with the structure of the temple as it once was, but in order to be prepared for the rebuilding of the temple, which is incumbent upon every generation. It's our duty, as it always has been the duty of the Jewish people, to be ready to rebuild the Holy Temple. So now, as ever, and even more so, when we are faced with the chaotic situation of those forces that seem to be poised to once again try and wrest the Temple Mount out of the heart of Israel, it's important for everyone to realize how significant these times are, and we are rallying around the study of the concept of the Holy Temple, not just for the purpose of being Torah scholars, not just for the purpose of doing the right thing in Hashem's eyes, but as the first step of the actual rebuilding. And there are other steps involved that we can be equally participatory in at the same time. So let's not forget that this is not the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. It's a pursuit of knowledge for Hashem's sake. And ultimately, when it comes to the topic of the Holy Temple, we are talking about nothing less than the rebuilding of the Holy Temple, which will bring about the resting of the Divine Presence. So, apropos to all of this, we have one more halakha in the 3rd chapter of Maimonides' Laws of the Chosen House, Beit HaBechira, the Rambam. And it's the 18th halakha in Parak Gimel. And as we're talking so much now, refreshing ourselves, having been away a little bit from this study and having been studying other things about the holidays, we find that we have one more halakha left in this chapter, and that halakha, I think, is very specifically well-timed for the moment that we are at now in history, which is, again, a challenge that's being issued to us to react, to rise up, and to express our position clearly for Hashem regarding the building of the temple, because this entry, the 18th entry, Halakha Yud Chet, in Parak Gimel, the 3rd chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, is about the importance of the Kohanim to sanctify themselves before doing the service in the temple. And that is something which actually, as we will learn, applies to all people. We always have to refresh ourselves and sanctify ourselves before doing any of our divine service. And we can infer that from the duty of the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. So this halakha deals exclusively with the wash basin, the laver. This, of course, comes from the book of Exodus, from Parshat Kitisa. We read in Exodus chapter 30, beginning in verse 17. And Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "You shall also make a laver of brass, and its pedestal also of brass for washing. And you shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar, and you shall put water in it. For Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet there. When they go into the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, that they should not die. Or when they come near to the altar to minister, to burn offering made by fire to Hashem, so they shall wash their hands and their feet, that they should not die. And it shall be a statute forever to them, to him and to his seed, throughout their generations." So the first vessel that is imperative for the service in the Holy Temple is really the laver, the Kiyor, because before attending to any of their sacred duties in the Beit HaMikdash, the Kohanim, beginning with Aaron and all of his children, must sanctify, is the word, their hands and feet. And this is the expression that our sages use. It's called Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, to sanctify the hands and feet, not just washing. And in the very beginning of our studies, when we first began to talk about the laws of Beit HaBechira, early on we had occasion to talk about the laver and its significance in that it was actually constructed from a donation that was brought forth by the righteous women of the congregation of Israel. They all brought their highly polished mirrors, and those mirrors, the same mirrors that were used by the women to make themselves attractive to their husbands during the time of the evil decree of Pharaoh that he did not want any more Jewish souls to be brought into the world. Moses had given the directive for the entire house of Israel to come forward with their donations for the construction of the tabernacle, and the women came forth with their donation of their highly polished mirrors. And the first reaction, as we mentioned then, of Moses was to refuse the donation because he felt that it was unseemly for this to be actually included in the temple. And God informed him that he was totally mistaken, and God felt it was very, very beautiful and apropos that the women's mirrors be used to construct the laver. And this is such an important point that we learn that later on there are certain vessels that are not necessarily required to be out of gold, but later on, if the congregation becomes wealthy, if they're able to make certain things out of gold and to include a great deal of gold in the Holy Temple, it's very praiseworthy to make the temple as beautiful as possible. But the laver is something that should always be made out of nechoshet, which here, according to these verses, we are translating as brass. Sometimes it seems to be translated as copper. And that was so precious in the eyes of God that the women were motivated to donate their mirrors, that God said that this vessel should always be made out of nechoshet, brass or copper. And how beautiful as well that the very first vessel which needs to be accessed, which needs to be used by the Kohanim every day at dawn, is this very vessel. And furthermore, that this is the secret of their sanctification. In other words, before doing any of their duties, before bringing the offerings, they must cleanse themselves with the water of the laver. So not only did God inform Moses, no, this is very holy to me, the motivation of the women, which was so pure and so holy, not only is that special to me, but that is actually the very element which will bring about the sanctification, the uplifting of the Kohanim. So those are the verses in the Torah referring to God's commandments, original commandment at the time of the tabernacle, to construct the laver. And Maimonides begins in Halacha Yudchet, the 18th entry and final entry of the 3rd chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira. He tells us, HaKiyor Hayu lo 12 dad. Originally, in the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, the laver had 12 faucets. Kedei sheyu kol hakohanim haoskim betamid mikadshim mimenu ke'echad. So that all of the priests that are attending to the daily offering would be able to sanctify themselves at once. Now, actually, we have a Mishnah in Tractate Yoma that tells us specifically that there was a very particular Kohen Gadol, one of the high priests in the time of the Second Temple. His name was Ben Katin. And this Ben Katin apparently had an innovative streak because he is associated and accredited with a number of innovations that were all for the good. They were technologically innovative, or they were in some way an improvement in the situation. He was responsible for a number of innovations in the time of the Second Temple. And originally, what we learn there in that Mishnah in Tractate Yoma is that the first laver that was made by Bezalel in the time of Moshe, the laver of the tabernacle of the desert, that actually included only 2 faucets. And the idea of Ben Katin was to make a laver that would be big enough to facilitate the entire staff of Kohanim, all of the Kohanim that are present, that are mandated to work together to bring the offering, the daily offering, the tamid, or 12 Kohanim altogether. So in order to facilitate their ability to sanctify themselves at one time. And as we have learned, this was done in a very specific manner. The washing, the cleansing of the hands and feet of the Kohanim. The Kohen actually bent down at the faucet of the Kiyor, of the laver, and placed his right and left hands above his right and left feet, and released the water, and cleansed his hands and feet at the same time. And this was necessary not only at the beginning of the day, before beginning the divine service, but also at other occasions when there was any interruption, certain interruptions during the course of the day. The Kohanim were necessitated to do the Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, the sanctification of the hands and feet, again. So once again, HaKiyor Hayulo 12 dad, Kedei sheyu kol hakohanim haoskim betamid mikadshim mimenu ke'echad. The Rambam tells us the Kiyor, and again, the Kiyor of the Second Temple that was made by Ben Katin, as we learn in the Mishnah in Yoma, had 12 faucets in order to facilitate all of the Kohanim that are working with the daily offering to sanctify themselves at once. Umuchni asulo shiyu ba hamayim tamid v'hi chol. And there was another aspect of the Kiyor called the muchni. And this aspect, I say, of the Kiyor was not a sacred part of the vessel, not in fact an intrinsic part of the vessel, was actually considered to be chol, which literally translates as mundane. See, there is the klei sharet, the vessel which is actually sanctified for use in the Holy Temple. And then this muchni was some sort of peripheral part of the vessel, or perhaps a system, we'll see. There's a controversy about exactly what the muchni was. but it was not on the level of sanctity at all, as was the actual Kiyor. Kedei shelo yihiyu hamayim shaba nifsalin belina. This is a very interesting and specific concept of the laws pertaining to purity and impurity in the Holy Temple. There is a law that anything that is left overnight in a sacred vessel becomes invalid. And it's called that it is pasul belina, literally becomes invalid by sleeping. In other words, by being present in the sacred vessel overnight, it becomes invalid. Shehakiyor miklei hakodesh umikadesh v'chol davar sheitkadesh b'kli kodesh imlan nifsal, because this vessel, the Kiyor, is one of the sacred vessels, and it in turn imparts sanctity. And once something has been placed in the sacred vessel, and thus becomes itself sanctified, if night falls and it is still in the vessel, then it becomes invalidated. So the issue here regarding the muchni is actually quite complex. And because of the fact that it was necessary for the Kohanim to begin their service both in the morning and in the evening by sanctifying their hands and feet, it was necessary for the water to always be accessible and to be pure. And incidentally, there is another law that Maimonides discusses further on in his Laws of the Chosen House, not in his Laws of the Chosen House, but in his Laws of the proper methods of conduct of how one must appear, how the Kohanim must appear and conduct themselves in the Holy Temple. This is called the laws of Biyat HaMikdash, of coming to the sanctuary. There, in the 5th chapter of that part of his work, he discusses the fact that the penalty of a Kohen, and this is something that our sages establish, the penalty for a Kohen that does any of his service having not sanctified firsthand his hands and feet, is first of all that his service is actually invalid, and also that he is actually, it's called chayav mita b'yedei shamayim, he actually has earned for himself the penalty of death by the hands of heaven. So the idea of the Kohen being properly prepared and having sanctified his hands and feet is extremely important. Now, in the Talmud, in the tractate Yoma, there we have an explanation as to exactly the nature of the muchni, this extra part of the vessel. And it's actually depicted, according to the sources, in two different ways. The Talmud tells us that this word muchni, which actually the root of the Hebrew word, denotes some sort of mechanization, some sort of mechanical apparatus. The Talmud seems to indicate that this was actually like a large wheel, some sort of mechanical wheel, that by the agency of this wheel, the entire vessel of the laver was lowered into a well of water. And in fact, Maimonides himself, in the place that we cited previously in his Laws of Coming to the Temple, explains that because of the fact that water which is left overnight in a sacred vessel becomes invalid, they would plunge the Kiyor, they would lower the Kiyor itself, the entire vessel, into the water of some sort of mikvah, some sort of gathering of water, some sort of spring. And then in the morning, when it was necessary for the water of the Kiyor to be accessed in order to provide the sanctification for the Kohanim, they would raise the Kiyor out from the well. In other words, and in fact we have some illustrations that show how this worked exactly according to this opinion, that there was a well, a gathering of water next to the place of the Kiyor in the Holy Temple, and by the agency of this mechanical wheel and pulley, the Kiyor was lowered into the water and then was raised up. And of course, this would facilitate the circumventing of the water itself being in the vessel overnight, because as opposed to that, the vessel itself was in the water. And so the water would be accessible at the time of need when it was ready to begin, when they were ready to begin the service in the morning. So this is one interpretation of the concept of mukhni, the concept of this mechanical apparatus that facilitated somehow the circumventing of the problem of water becoming invalid overnight, this mechanical wheel and pulley. However, there seems to be another opinion which is expressed as well, and that in fact is along the lines of what Maimonides is expressing in our halacha here in number 18. Because here he tells us specifically that the mukhni was a vessel that was mundane. It was in itself a vessel which was mundane, meaning it was chol. It did not have the din, it did not have the legal halachic classification of kodesh, and therefore a part of the vessel, whatever goes on in that part of the vessel is chulin, is not sanctified. And according to this opinion, any water which was found overnight in that part of the vessel would not become invalid because it's not actually intrinsically a part of the sacred vessel. It's a separate part. And this is another explanation of the mukhni. And in the Rambam's explanation, in his commentary on the Mishnah, in Tractate Yoma, he explains that this particular vessel was fit onto the Kiyor itself, and there was always water there. And the water there was released a little bit at a time when it was necessary, released into the Kiyor itself, and that part of the vessel itself is the mukhni. And in fact, in the illustrations that you can see of the Kiyor that has been thus far constructed by the Temple Institute, the mukhni is really the top part of the vessel. The bottom part is the laver itself, which is the klei sharet, the sacred, sanctified part of the vessel. And the top part is considered to be chol, in other words, not sanctified. An internal system of plumbing, an internal faucet, enables the water at the top of the vessel to be released at will into the lower part of the vessel so that it would be available, and that would facilitate the water being present in order for the Kohanim to sanctify their hands and feet when it came time to bring the Tamid. And here we seem to have a contradiction in the words of Maimonides himself, in other words, because in one place he seems to indicate that that the mukhni is this concept of the pulley and the wheel. And yet in our own halacha here, in this chapter, he seems to indicate that it's actually a part and parcel, an integral part of the laver, except that it's not really part of the laver, because the laver is the main body of the vessel, whereas the mukhni is non-sanctified. And different explanations have been given of how to rectify these two different opinions that Maimonides himself expresses and others. Was the mukhni, in fact, a whole elaborate system of a wheel and a pulley in which the laver itself was immersed in water and was afterwards raised up, and that the water found in the laver was therefore not invalidated overnight? Or was the mukhni an additional part that was not sanctified, and inside the mechanism of the vessel, water was released down into the laver? Basically, the way that we are instructed to understand the different opinions is that Maimonides is both telling us a halachic way in which the problem can be facilitated. In other words, an idea that can and perhaps was implemented, and he's also telling us how it was actually done in the time of the Second Temple. Exactly which is not exactly clear, and there are different ways of interpreting this, different commentaries, and it is possible, in fact, that both were used at different historical periods and different times. And in any event, the mukhni can be defined both as the additional part of the laver, which is non-sanctified, and also as the wheel and pulley, which enabled the laver to be immersed fully into the water. At the present time, in the Temple Institute, one of the major projects that we are working on is a new laver. very, very large, which will facilitate, as Ben Katin did in his time, the ability for all of the Kohanim that are necessitated to work together to bring the Korban Tamid, the daily offering, both in the morning and in the evening, to wash their hands and feet, to sanctify their hands and feet at one time, simultaneously. This is a major project of the Institute, one which is utilizing the latest technology, and just as Ben Katin made his innovation at the time of the Second Temple, so also in our time, according to the Megillat HaMikdash, which King David refers to, that we learnt all about, there is room for technological innovation in every generation. So with God's help, when it comes time for us to rebuild the temple, we will also be able to use the technology that's become available to us in our time as well for His service, all towards the rebuilding of the temple in our time, speedily, the resting of the divine presence, once again, the light to Israel and the light to the nations.